Good afternoon, Micah. I'm so happy that you're here. How's your weekend going?
That's been fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So, a little birdie told me you had some baseball games this weekend, maybe for your kiddos. What was that like? Was the weather
Yes.
favorable? Were there good snacks?
No, it's really hot. I live in North Carolina in Charlotte, and so I'm chasing around 5 and 6 year olds as a coach pitch T-ball head coach this season, which has a little bit of responsibility, but mainly everyone looks to you to try to take care of their kids for an hour, which can be tough when it's 95 degrees outside.
Pretty tough, I would say. Indeed, we've talked about all the different lessons you and I that like kiddos are having right now of living in this pandemic world. I'm just kind of like curious, this is completely random, but head coach of T-ball, has there been some big lessons in that for you? Is it a role that you ever envisioned yourself to be in?
I think when you have children, you anticipate that you're going to have to be involved in some capacity and with what they do. And in this case, my oldest son likes to experiment with different sports. So this is the third season he's played baseball. It might be his last. He wants to try some other things, and he's getting older, so it starts to get more competitive, which is not really where he wants to be. So I never thought I'd be a head coach, but when the email went out that said, "Hey, we need help," I said, "I can do that."
Good on you. I feel like I'm the kind of person like, let's see if anyone else signs up. And then like if they really need someone, maybe that's my calling. Maybe that's how I know. But you were right there ready for them.
Yeah, that was me for the first 2 seasons, and now on the third, I figured, all right, I can probably do this.
That's so fun. So we'll have to have a whole other conversation on what it's like to be a head coach of T-ball because I'm very curious, but I'm really excited to speak with you today about your professional calling. This is Micah Cash, photographer extraordinaire. You've done really cool social commentary kind of work through your photography, which caught my eye scrolling Instagram, and I can't wait to know more about your intention behind it. So thank you again for being here. We like to start at the beginning. I'd love to understand, Micah, like where you grew up, when photography came into the realm of things you were interested in, and kind of just your journey to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was born in Texas and lived the first part of my childhood there, and then moved to South Carolina. And all of my adolescence and even college, I went to the University of South Carolina for my undergraduate degree. And so I'm a Southerner, but also a Texan, which can be a strange combination. Yes, I know Texas is in the South, but it's a whole different place.
Yes.
So if you haven't been there, that makes sense. If you have been there, that makes sense. And then I spent a decade in Baltimore, Maryland, and got my master's degree at the University of Connecticut. And all of this time, I've been a musician. I've done a lot of different creative things in my life, but I was always felt a calling toward visual art and the visual arts in general. And until I went to the University of Connecticut for my master's degree, I was a painter. I would do painting, printmaking, drawing, but painting was my primary medium. And I loved it. I loved the self-expression of it. I loved this ability for me to talk about myself and my emotions and my thoughts in this very traditional language that had been around for, multiple millennia. And when I was in graduate school, I started wanting to change what I wanted to talk about, not so much about myself, but about where I lived or where I was from or where I found myself and the narratives of that place, not only the land specifically, but its culture and the people of those places. And I found the way that I utilize painting was not the best method for that delivery and for that content to be communicated. And so I started looking around for new things to try to talk about what I wanted to talk about. And in 2013, while I was on a sort of field work for a grant that I had been awarded, I was making reference photography for large paintings that I did eventually make. I did make these large scale paintings. But what I realized was the camera was a better way for me to communicate and to ask the questions I wanted to ask about the land, specifically the alteration of the land and how it affected people and society, than the paintings. And the paintings then very quickly became about me and my memory and my emotions of being within those places. So that was an interesting situation when I had content that I could talk about in two different ways, and two very different ways, because the outputs from those two media were very different.
That's
And ever since then, I've been really a photographer. So sorry about that.
No, you're great. It's such a cool story, and I didn't realize that was how it came to be. I actually, we just finished our first week of fall semester. Now I'm getting my social work degree, and I was reading my research textbook, and it talked about how, like, a great researcher, even like a responsible researcher, is not just going to use the method to collect data that they like the best. They're going to use the one that's the best fit for what they're trying to achieve. And so I think it was really brave and flexible of you to be like, this is what I want to achieve. And painting is not going to always be the best answer for how to get it. And so your willingness to pivot to photography, I think is really inspirational and very cool. You also mentioned that while you were in graduate school, your kind of like focal interest pivoted from self to community, I guess.
That's
Can
right.
you like recall, what inspired that change, or like what were things happening in your life that made you more community conscious? Because I think that is a cool paradigm kind of change.
Yes. And what's interesting is the catalyst for that is going to sound cheesy, because I was working in art museums and arts nonprofits, which tend to be my day job. All throughout my career, I've worked in arts nonprofits of some variety, doing some type of service work to that organization. And I had been in that position for almost 7 years. And, I started to flex my muscles. My paintings had kind of gotten stale and I wasn't happy. And so I started looking at residencies, and I had a really great boss and a really great support structure at that museum. And so I said, look, I'm going to start applying to some 2-week residencies, and I'm going to take an LOA and just try to kickstart what I'm trying to do. And at the same time, thinking about graduate school. And I went to Wyoming, which seems to be the place where everybody goes and has these like conversion experiences. And so I got into a residency that was 2 weeks long in Wyoming. And it was on this working dude ranch that was like 16,000 acres. And I was with a whole handful of super talented people from across the spectrum. There were authors, there were musicians, there were visual artists, and most of us, some of us really made a lot of work, and it was fantastic. Most of us, I think, took that time to talk to each other and to walk around this ranch and to experience what, to me, being from the East Coast and from the South, was a vastly different landscape. And one of the things I found is, as I started going into town, and you go to bars, you go to places where locals hang out, people that live in this part of Wyoming, not tourists, and hearing their stories is how they are very representative of the landscape, which is a very harsh landscape. But they weren't harsh, but they had harsh exteriors, if that makes sense. So that really fascinated me. And what that did was, that catalyst was, throughout my career as a hobby, right, I was really interested in issues of environmental ethics and social justice, but those narratives were self-contained, right? I'd come home and I would read certain books, or I would do certain types of research in those narratives. But suddenly now I'm in a space where I want to understand, well, how are the people of Wyoming this way, socially, politically, physically? What's up with that? And so then I sort of realized that's how the two things came together. And then when I went to graduate school, I went into graduate school as somebody that was a straight abstract painter, non-objective, not even shapes, it's just colors, sort of like moody swirls of color around the canvas. And I went in and I told the professors, yeah, I'm thinking about doing landscape-based work. And to their credit, they were like, that sounds awesome. Do something different. Why not? That's not what we expected you to say when you got here. And so that started my journey with landscape as the language. And I have sort of maintained that conversation ever since.
What a cool journey. You're right. Was it Wyoming, you said, is where you went?
It was Wyoming. Yeah, that's where I went. It was outside of, I believe, Saratoga, Wyoming. I don't think that residency exists anymore, but it was fantastic. It was beautiful.
It is a pretty transformative place. It just feels so different for us folks who are towards the east or the center, or really anywhere other than Wyoming and Montana might be similar, but everywhere else I think is pretty different. From the two of those, I love that started your curiosity in your master's program. So thank you for explaining that chronology. In your bio, I think I read, you use landscapes and architecture as ways to explore narratives of utilization, demarcation, and ownership. I'd love for you to speak a little bit more about that, like specific use of landscape in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I call myself, a conceptual landscape artist, a conceptual landscape photographer. And really what that means is I'm not interested in the beautiful or the sublime. I mean, I am personally, but not artistically when I want to study that kind of work and ask hard questions about it. What I'm most interested in is how we as a society, as culture, value each other, and the landscape becomes the place where that takes place, right? So if we as a society evolve in a relationship with the land that we're on and how we use that land, it then changes us as a society. We then in turn change it to fit our goals and aspirations. And that's not always good, right? We know, right, as a society, as a culture, as a race, that we don't always have the best intentions. And the land is the battlefield where that plays out. And in many ways, not only in sort of a discussion of conquest, but also issues of ownership and wealth. Who owns it? Who used to own it? How is it taken? How do different cultures that don't necessarily share the same economic system value the same plot of land different ways? So this idea of utilization, how it is used, how it has been used in the past, and how it could potentially be used in the future across all spectrums, right? We think about that in terms of agriculture. It could be residential and housing. It could be government. It could be land that is basically like some type of wasteland because of some type of technical or toxic situation that went on there, and that then shapes us again. So thinking about utilization and ownership, because who owns it then gets to dictate that. Someone who owns it might not be the person that lives on it, or might have been the person that used to live on it. So it gets really messy. And so my interest in landscape and architecture is that those are the languages I like to use to talk about those really messy conversations, because they're the languages that we readily see and all of us can speak. I find, and over the course of my career, as a scholar and as an artist, that when visual art goes to certain lengths, not everybody can speak that language, especially when you start to really push the envelope and be more avant-garde. Not everybody can get into that conversation, but everybody understands landscape in some capacity. Everybody understands architecture in some capacity because we operate within it every day. And so using those two languages allows me to have very broad discussions with individuals and allows people to come into those conversations that usually do have consequences, right? These conversations can get emotional and they can get dramatic at times because you're bringing up really sensitive topics. But if everybody starts at the landscape space and the architecture space, they can participate because they know it. So that's sort of the decision I made in that regard. And so when I talk about utilization, ownership, and demarcation, it's really just a way for me to say, this is what I'm interested in: land, how it is utilized, how it is changed, how it is owned, and then I can jump into specific narratives from there.
I love that. I think it's so powerful. I really appreciate in your work how you do try to bring in a lot of voices with this common denominator of we've all been in a parking lot. We've all been,
Yeah.
there are touch points for each person. And I think, I think back even to grade school history, like we all learned about Jacob Riis and like the photographs of the housing projects in New York City and how it was, one of the first things that brought attention to the plight of the lower income community, and it's just deplorable living conditions. Like a photo speaks 1,000 words, right, they say. And I feel like your work also just communicates so much. The land is telling the story of what's happening, even if the people who are making those decisions don't always want us to be super conscious of what's happening, right, and the legacy that it's creating. So I'm excited to pull up your work and start to speak more specifically to these projects. The first one we have here is from your Dangerous Waters series. So how did you decide that this was something you wanted to speak about? Let's go through that whole thing.
Yeah, so absolutely. Dangerous Waters was a project I worked on for about 4 years, and it documented the contemporary imagery and contemporary utilization of the Tennessee Valley Authority's hydroelectric dams, many of which were created in the 30s to 50s as part of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was a flagship New Deal program. And what interested me in this is I was revolving around narratives of self-sacrifice, sacrifice for the common good, collective sacrifice, communal discussions and communal sacrifice in many ways, and also this idea of government's role in attempting to make life better. And so this was 2013, through 2016, 2017 for the most part, right? So this is well before we had a pandemic or anything like that. But I was asking these questions and thinking about them in a society that didn't necessarily seem to value some of those approaches anymore. And so I had settled on this metaphor of hydroelectric dams as being one of those sort of touchstones, right? So you build a dam, it creates power, it can create lakefront property, it can create a whole host of recreation for people, assuming people can get on that lake. However, it also has very severe negative consequences, right? It floods land permanently. Many times that land has been utilized by different people because it's been in these beautiful valleys where there was some type of creek and maybe even farmland down in those valleys. And so people had to then forcibly be removed from that land. That land had to be taken by some type of entity, whether government or a private enterprise, to create this dam. And so you have a cost benefit analysis that is not only monetary, but is also social. And in the case of the Tennessee Valley Authority, what I thought was, if I'm going to look into this metaphor and try to use it artistically, I wanted to go where it was the most impactful. I wanted to go all in. And outside of everything that has been happening in India and China with the building of these massive dams, which is not where I live, right? I don't live in China, I don't live in India, and I can follow along in the news, but I do live in the United States, and more particularly, I'm a Southerner. And so I knew many of the stories of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And so for me, that was like the touchstone point. If I'm going to talk about dams, let's talk about the kind of dams on the East Coast that the government built to help electrify the rural South and to help to create power for the Manhattan Project, to help to radically alter a 7-state region of the United States because it was prone to flooding. And so now you suddenly have this discussion of, here are the things that can be gained and why the government created this agency to do this. And then also let's talk about what had to be sacrificed in order for that to happen. And so you think about 1.3 million acres being taken by eminent domain. You think about 20,000 graves that had to be relocated. You think about the amount of like 13,000 to 20,000 people that had to be forcibly removed or volunteer to be removed in this case for the Tennessee Valley Authority. And these discussions of sacrifice and communal welfare take place during the Great Depression up through World War II, right? When we were a very different country than we are today. And so that was the starting point. And so what I did for 4 years is I went to these hydroelectric dam sites, some of them built by the Tennessee Valley Authority, some of them absorbed by the Tennessee Valley Authority over the years. And I chronicled what they look like today and really focused not so much on the architecture of the hydroelectric dam, but the landscape of consequence. So the recreational space, both upstream and downstream from these dams, right? Because that is a benefit that has been gained. Now there's a lake, here's the swimming area, here's the place where you can picnic, here are all the different parks that have been created, here are the campgrounds, and focused also on the industry of the spaces. And so my attempt for this project was to represent as many points of view as I could from along that spectrum of very positive and gracious for the Tennessee Valley Authority to a citizen that is very skeptical and angry about the Tennessee Valley Authority, even 3 to 4 generations later. So the imagery in that book that was published in 2017 has many different points of view. So you'll have some images that really celebrate the joy of the space that has been created, and some images that seem very cynical and very upset about what has been created. And then of course, things in between that spectrum. And what I tried is I tried to remove myself and my bias from those photographs and try to chronicle them and photograph them from a variety of vantage points.
It's such a powerful project, and you explain it so well. So thank you for taking the time to talk
Sure.
us through it. It's amazing the amount of intention that goes into each, touch point with it. And I love that you are capturing the positives and the negatives, because like that's probably the best way to be neutral, actually. Like, I don't know if you could succeed without showing the whole spectrum of what's going on. And so I'm kind of curious about, so you decide to embark on this project, you're going to take a series of photos. Do you need to ask permission of anyone? Like, this looks like a challenging like angle. Like, where is this photo on the screen happening? And how are you interacting with people in the, like, while this is a work in progress?
Yeah, great question. And that is one of the beautiful things about the Tennessee Valley Authority is, to this day, all of that land and everything that was built upon it is owned by the government, which means it's owned by us. And the Tennessee Valley Authority takes a very transparent and collective ownership view of that. So all of the dams you are able to tour, you just have to call them and they welcome you in, and they'll give you a tour of what it is. All of the dams you can walk on, you can walk up to them, you can touch them within reason. There's some security areas, right? You can't necessarily just waltz into the powerhouse where they are actually converting water to electricity, but you can tour it. You just got to give them a call, they do a background check, and they bring you in at a predetermined time. So this idea that since we own these spaces, they were readily available for me to photograph and to interact with and to be there. And so it allowed the kind of access that I needed to make this work, that if these dams were privately owned by a utility company on, the stock market, I would not have that ability at all. I mean, I would have to deal with an army of lawyers. I would be denied any type of permission. In fact, I would never even get close to that dam. So I think that makes it more powerful as a contemplation of government's role in our society and the power that government can have if it's done correctly, right? If you remain true to the origins of what this project was. And that's a complicated discussion, right? Because Tennessee Valley Authority as an organization has wavered from its initial founding charter, and it goes away and it comes back, and as leadership changes, the role of the organization changes, and so it's a living entity that still exists. So that level of access was really important. And while I was there, these dams, for the most part, are highly utilized by individuals, right? I mean, particularly the environmental side of this. The lakes are utilized by everybody. There's always boats out on them. The campgrounds are usually full in the summers. People are fishing, people are playing on the playgrounds. While there might not be a lot of people at the dam itself, because I think viewing hydroelectric architecture as a spectator is not necessarily something that is in our collective zeitgeist these days, but it certainly was in the 50s and 60s and the 40s. And so there's still architecture there for you to pull your car up, get out, and have a vantage point of what these magnificent structures can do. And so I actually spent a lot of time talking to people on these TVA reservations and talking to them about how they utilize this space, how they feel about TVA as an organization. And one of the interesting things about it is, because TVA is centralized in the 7-state region and only affects people who live in that region, their life is intertwined with TVA completely. Like you can't disassociate it. Like everybody has some type of family member that worked for TVA, potentially grandparents that built these dams, or had land that is at the bottom of a lake that they wish they still had, but it was their grandparents, and their grandparents gave it up willingly in most cases. So it's really complicated to have people that have such an intimate relationship with a power company try to talk to you about that, both positive and negative, right? Because it's just like you trying to talk about anyone in your family, right? Like it's a complicated relationship, and you kind of love them and respect them, but at times you get really annoyed by them. And in the case of TVA, they have a full power portfolio. So there's nuclear, there's combined cycle, there's fossil, all of that pumps out power for the Tennessee Valley. And I just chose specifically to talk about the hydroelectric component.
It's I love the idea of how it's like family, this water authority and how it's so intertwined. I also think about, if someone comes up to me and starts asking me questions about my sister, I'm gonna be like, who are you? Like, why do you care? Like, why are you, what do you want to know about her? How did you break that barrier, like establish rapport quickly? It's something we think about in social work a lot. And I'm sure in these human interactions, it comes up for you too, maybe.
Yeah, it's just something I'm good at. I can talk to anybody, and even if there's someone I don't agree with, so long as that person is being respectful at the time, we can have a very in-depth conversation. And in the case of TVA, if I'm not making photographs downstream of a dam and there's two or three people fishing and we're hanging out, like I'll talk to them. So assuming they want me to talk to them,
Yeah.
and we'll talk about their love of fishing. We'll talk about how and why this space that they come to is a good fishing spot. And most likely it's a good fishing spot because the Tennessee Valley Authority has cultivated it. Whether they are bringing in fish or they are oxygenating the water in the right way to make sure it's a good breeding ground for fish, because they want those anglers to be able to come out and recreate.
I definitely believe that you would be easy to approach. You were so nice to answer by email and be here. So I'm not surprised at all. This project also, you mentioned it was from like 2013 to 16, about, so like 3 years long of focusing on these waters. My background is in part in operations. I'm always curious about timelines and how things work. And did you set out knowing that this was going to be a multi-year sort of project for you? What made that length of time like useful? How was it utilized?
Yeah, no, I never thought I would take that long. And what happened is the project kept growing. So I set out there to see if there was anything and to make paintings. And then the paintings turned into photographs. And so then I was like, oh, so I have something here. Let me go back and finish this portfolio. And so the plan was to have about a 20 image portfolio. And then after that started, I thought, well, there's a couple things I really want to need to add to this. Maybe narratives of joy, or maybe narratives of ecological change. There's not a whole lot of that in the book because I tend to be more interested in humanistic issues, right? So like culture and society of us as humans, not necessarily the ecological side always. So I can be kind of blind to that. I mean, I'm very versed in it and I see what is happening to the land. But it isn't necessarily what I will photograph at that time. So I might say, oh, I need to go back and photograph a couple things, ecologically speaking, photograph a couple things that maybe show people whitewater rafting down some of these rivers that are created to whitewater raft. And when on a Saturday, they turn the river on and the water starts coming out and you have this really great whitewater course that, TVA helps cultivate for local tourism, especially natural tourism. So I went back a third time. And then I started talking about this work and showcasing this work and having artist talks and exhibiting it. And then it turned into a book deal, essentially, with University of Tennessee Press. And we decided, let's have about 70 photographs. And so that's when I can get much more nuanced. That's when I can get much more contextual. And so that led to about 2 or 3 other trips to the area, extensive trips, where I really tried to make some contextual imagery and imagery that then could buttress some of the heavier hitting images of the portfolio. Because when you have a book, suddenly I have a lot more space to tell a story.
Yes.
And you need softer images. You need images that can lend support to the ones that are the images that I might print and put in an exhibition.
That's so cool how all that fits together. The book idea, was that something that you pitched to the university, that they found your work and came to you? How did that come to fruition?
No, and what's interesting about it is, as a photographer, I think most photographers think, I would love to have a book out of this project, assuming the project is good enough to have a book or big enough to have a book. And it's just one of those natural inclinations, because the tradition of photo books is so strong within the photographic medium. And so, of course, I had entertained the idea, but I had really sort of stopped at like about a 40 image portfolio. And I thought to myself, maybe that's all I really need for this. But I was presenting at a conference and this work, and I actually had an editor come up to me and ask me if I had thought about it making long form. Do you think the project is strong enough to hold a book? And so we talked about it, and he came to my presentation, and I kind of wrote a proposal together. And next thing I know, University of Tennessee Press is printing the book. And we worked on that book for about, I'd say, almost 18 months. Because I had to write not only the proposal for it, but I had to write about 12,000 words. We decided that I would be the only contributor from a textual side. And then they designed the book, and we sequenced it, and it had to go through peer review, which took an extra 6 months.
Oh my gosh, what a tremendous accolade though to be presenting and have someone, see the value, understand the story so much as to want to work with you to make it even bigger. Just seems like a really special experience, and it's definitely adding a lot of value for everyone who reads it and learns about these different systems that we all have a chance to explore because they're public. So the next two works, or like series of works, that I'd love to learn more about is the Landmarks Project and Keeping Watch on Habitat. I put them both together because I think they were both commissioned projects. So I'm very interested about how those commissions came to be, and just again, the stories behind these.
Yeah, and what's interesting about these two projects is coming off of Dangerous Waters, and these sort of took place while Dangerous Waters was being printed. So there was about a year when the text and the imagery was done before the book came out. And these two projects, I decided I wanted to be more local. So that means the Charlotte region, in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one of them was commissioned through the local Arts and Science Council. And it was a program where people sort of buy into this and they get art on the outside. So you sort of pay a certain amount of money, and like 9 or 10 artists will create a piece of art, and then everybody goes home with 9 or 10 pieces of art at the end of the year, kind of thing. It was a cool idea. And I had pitched this idea of photographing construction and places in change throughout Charlotte, because Charlotte has just exploded in population and growth and economics. And so the Charlotte of the 90s is quickly being bulldozed, right, for all this new space. And so I sort of pitched this idea and photographed places where houses were being built, photographed places of consequence throughout the greater Charlotte area. And I particularly decided to photograph places that were on the margins. Charlotte has very hard and fast, I want to say like sort of hard and fast gaps between and economics. There's like very real disparities amongst race, amongst economics, and sections of the city that are highly concentrated in wealth and whiteness, and other portions of the city that are actually quite poor, that are withheld from any type of economic growth in many ways. And I don't necessarily want to say segregation. That's definitely there. It's cooked into the cake, but Charlotte is actually a very diverse city with a lot of other marginalized cultures that have sort of dispersed into that as well. And so I wanted to go to some of those areas along the margins, and those areas are quickly being gentrified and being changed. And so I wanted to make photographs about that. And it was good. It was a solid series. I enjoyed it. It was very local, and it was a local series that means nothing to anybody outside of Charlotte. And even now, 5 years later, it really means nothing, because all the spaces I photographed, for the most part, have been rebuilt and changed dramatically. So it's a very sort of social documentary piece about like, this is what Charlotte looked like in 2016 for 6 months, and then it has radically changed. And Keeping Watch on Habitat was also a local commission through the university, UNC Charlotte, where there was an exhibition talking about how we influence where we live, and how land influences who we are, and how land is really habitat for animals and ecologies. And I took that to be like, well, I'm part of that ecology. So I was, there were a couple artists in that exhibition that thought about land from a human perspective, not just so much from that of an animal or an insect. And so the one diptych you have on the screen is actually a photograph of a nature preserve from the parking lot where this nature preserve is created, and sort of kept, I guess, as readily available for tourism, but also natural as could be, like many national parks are, right? Highly cultivated We think of national parks as being wild, but they're actually quite controlled. Whereas this image from Fontana Dam is a visitor center that sort of showcases what they're trying to do and what they're trying to change in a safer space, right? So not really natural, but showcasing the naturalness of the space that they have cultivated versus sort of this sort of naturally existing ecological space that is also cultivated. And one of the things, these two in particular, and there were a couple other projects I did in the span of about 3 years that were very local into Charlotte. And I learned a lot of things. I learned when you start documenting landscape and architecture, if it's not something massive and historic, like a hydroelectric dam, it vanishes pretty quickly. So that gives a shelf life to that project. It also, people outside of a hyper local space aren't really going to care about that work. And so when it comes time to maybe exhibit that work across the country, not everybody's interested in it because the narrative is so local and so regional. And TVA suffered from that a little bit. Dangerous Waters suffered from that a little bit, but Dangerous Waters also is photographing a New Deal program. So anybody that wants to talk about the New Deal or New Deal progressivism or New Deal politics, Dangerous Waters has legs and has narratives that are still very relevant today. But if you're not interested in hydroelectric architecture or discussions of government interference or intervention, then it doesn't mean anything to you. And in the case of these projects, somebody in South Carolina does not care how Charlotte is growing unless they're a geographer or unless they're an urban planner. And so that really let me think about, so if I want to spend my time making work about place and making work about these narratives, I should think about how to make it accessible to more people so that more people can be a part of that conversation, and so that I can get the photographs places and show them, put them on the road, take them to new locations.
Yes, I love that aha moment for you. And I think that it helps me understand better some of the works that we'll get into later with the Waffle Houses and stuff. But to not miss it here, I love the abruptness of the Reedy Creek Nature Preserve one. It's just like parking lot and then forest. And I think what you said was so valuable about you were like, well, humans are part of nature. Like that makes sense. But we take it so for granted, or we don't really consider ourselves maybe part of nature all the time. Like the picture to the right of it, the second part of the diptych, it reminds me of like a zoo, and we're inside the air conditioned or the heated place. We're like, oh, look at those trees out there. But I have a tree next to my window right now too. They're part of my everyday. Some people have trees inside their apartment. I love also, or I'm really curious about, I believe I read that in the Keeping Watch on Habitat, each work was presented as a diptych, right? With one image on like accompanied by another one. What was the thought process there? How did the images complement each other?
I think that was the brilliant idea of the curator, Krista Camerato, of that exhibition, and she me and said, we're doing this discussion about habitat and that tension between nature and habitat, natural and unnatural, and we wanted you to be a part of it because this is what your work is about. But we're going to do these diptychs, and from my stance, that was an ability for me. And the obvious thing is to say, well, let's put natural, unnatural together. Let's put artificial and real. But it was also a way for me to think about how we might perceive and utilize maybe the same space differently. And so I didn't take it that far, but this discussion of Reedy Creek Nature Preserve being this wall of trees that I can enter into from the parking lot, and then this image from Fontana Dam, which is a showcase of what has been cultivated and preserved. That's a way, sort of like a propagandistic way to say, look at what we've done. Isn't this great? Whereas Reedy Creek doesn't necessarily force that upon you the same way. It says, we've still preserved this. We've still cultivated it. We've still cleaned it. We've kept it safe, but we don't necessarily want you to just look at it. We want you to go into it and use it. And of course, that's me framing it, right? And that's me taking a narrative and bottling it up into the lens and presenting it to you. I could just as easily made that photograph from Fontana Visitor Center on that balcony and not shown you those windows. And so this discussion of framing is something that that if somebody looks at the course of my work, they will see this discussion of interior exterior start to come into play a lot. It is a framing mechanism that fascinates me because it talks about control inside someplace and looking at something you have no control over. Even if you thought you did, even if you created it, suddenly you realize, oh, I no longer have control over that. And so I like that discussion, especially when you start to think about it in terms of economics or in terms of transience, like moving through space. And I'm in a space that is rooted to the ground, looking at a highway, and the highway is full of people moving. So it's me standing still, looking at movement. And then if I flip it the other way around, I would be moving, looking at someone standing still. And so this idea of vantage point and where I put my lens and what that means starts to really come into play as I'm working on these small projects.
Oh, that is so cool. So framing and vantage point are both ideas that I'm going to keep ruminating on. I think in like the social sciences world, we think too about just, the way you even process different scenarios changes how you perceive them. And so I think it comes up in a lot of different places, and we are all the better for just being aware that there are these different realities happening at the same time, depending on what your frame is.
And if we want to extend that further, right, the awareness that I am a white male, and so that changes my vantage point, or has the ability for me to understand how that changes my vantage point. And so I think there is discussions of me, as much as I enjoy reading feminist geography and this discussion of how bodies change through movement and where they exist, there is this element of conquest and a questioning of conquest, a questioning of ownership, that might just be interesting to me as a white male. I don't know that, but I think that's something that's very fascinating when I start to think about this work in the languages of anthropology and geography. How am I looking at the land, and why am I choosing to stop and set up my camera in this way to capture it? That's really rich subject matter. But that awareness, I think, is really important.
Yes, we could geek out about it. I think for hours, it's a very, very thought-provoking topic. This is also a very thought-provoking topic that I'm so excited for. This is the original project that brought me to you, Micah, made me want to learn more about your work. This is the Waffle House Vistas collection of photos, and this is just a small sampling of them. So this is now putting us 2018 to 2019 time period, I believe. So just
correct,
a year or so further down the pipeline. How did this come to be? Do you eat at Waffle Houses? I'm curious about their role in your life.
So it's interesting. So the short answer is I do eat at Waffle Houses, but not that often. I was somebody that would go to a Waffle House maybe once or twice a year when I was traveling, even in high school. But what ended up happening is this discussion of architecture, particularly vernacular architecture, what we build, the mundane things that we build, that we choose to ignore, that we actively seek to escape from, right? When we go on vacation, we want to go on vacation, we want to see something fantastic. We want to go to the mountains. We want to go to the beach. We would rather have a view of the beach or the mountains. We don't want a view of a McDonald's because we see McDonald's every day. But I have long argued that we can see how we treat each other, how we value each other, how we value ourselves by looking out the window and having a very sober discussion about what we see because we chose to build those things, or a company chose to build those things, or a government body chose to zone this land a certain way to allow for the creation of those things to exist or not exist. And that interests me. And so I actually was coming back from a mini book tour and a discussion in Atlanta, Georgia on dangerous waters in early 2018. And I stopped at a Waffle House and I had breakfast. First time I had been in Waffle House for quite a while because I had lived in Baltimore, Maryland for a long time and then in Connecticut. And I was somewhere on the road, probably I-20 somewhere. And I stop at this Waffle House and I make a social post that has an image of my book and my plate of eggs and bacon, and it says, if you like Waffle House, you will like Dangerous Waters, right? Because I'm in the middle of the self-promotion tour anyway, so like, let's sell a few more copies of the books. And I make that post. So I spent the whole trip home from making that post thinking, well, why would I say that? Like, what is it about Waffle House that led me to think that somebody that eats at a Waffle House would also like to purchase a copy of a book about socialized government and hydroelectric dams and the New Deal? Like, that doesn't make any sense. But for some reason, I felt that way. So it got me thinking a lot about Waffle House as a space for the working class. Waffle House is a space for the people that either have to sacrifice because they're told to, or have to sacrifice to potentially achieve more. And granted, Dangerous Waters is about government coming in and saying we're going to sacrifice collectively. But still that discussion of being working class, right? Being on the poor spectrum in America. And so I sat with that for a long time. And I've had a variety of other narratives that I've wanted to talk about, right? Issues of racial disparity, working class discussions. I'm very interested in economics and the economics of place and the economics, especially tourism. So there's a lot of these other discussions rolling through my head and looking for ways to talk about them. And so then fast forward about 3 months, I go to Myrtle Beach to do some field work for a project that is still, I'm working on, like still is underway. I still don't know what I'm trying to say in that space. And on my way home, I stop at a Waffle House. And this was the next time I had gone to that Waffle House for that one trip, waited 3 months on the road. I'm like, I want a big old breakfast. Let me do that. And so I'm eating these waffles. Actually, it wasn't waffles. It was eggs, bacon, my normal breakfast that I have there. And I looked up, and next to this Waffle House was a Dollar General. And I thought, very interested in the economics of Dollar General, by the way. And the capitalism, right? This idea of making money off the poor kind of thing. And I say, I wonder how many Waffle Houses are next to Dollar Generals. There's also a payday loan lender across the street to really show you like the demographic of this neighborhood, especially economically. And I said, that's interesting. Well, a normal person would use maps and data and just be able to tell you exactly how many Waffle Houses are next to Dollar Generals. But I'm an artist. I don't do that kind of stuff. I do stupid things like get in my car and spend the next year traveling to 65 restaurants in 11 states to see if that is true, to see what that looks like and feels like. And that's how this project was born. And so what I started doing is going to Waffle Houses and photographing the landscape, chronicling and documenting the landscape that was adjacent to these restaurants. And for me, what I wanted to do was be in the restaurant and looking out. And so there was about a month or two where I was making photographs where it was just what I saw through the windows with no imagery from the diner side. And they just looked like bleak landscapes. Like it was stuff that didn't make any sense. It didn't have any narrative. And so then I realized, I need to tell people where I am. And so then I kind of pulled in, and then a third of the frame became the booth and the windows to then frame what I was seeing. So then suddenly the Waffle House connotation comes in and hits you like a truck. I'm in a Waffle House and I'm looking at this landscape. And the beautiful thing about it is Waffle Houses exist in poor areas, in median, normal areas. We're going to say normal in quotation marks, right? And in affluent areas. There's Waffle Houses along the whole spectrum of economics in these states. And so you actually have the ability to look at landscapes from different areas, and also urban, suburban, and rural areas. Waffle Houses that are on interstates off the exit, Waffle Houses that are in residential locations, Waffle Houses that are in strip malls. It's all there. And so that idea of using Waffle House as the vantage point for me to then try to dive into some of these hard discussions is what took shape.
So cool. You mentioned in like these states, but I would love for you to speak more specifically about the states that you're photographing the Waffle Houses in, and because there was some intention to not make it too broad a scope too, I believe.
Yes, that's correct. So I chose to make Waffle House vistas about the southeastern United States and to only document that section of the country. Waffle House exists in 25 states, I believe. I haven't looked since the pandemic to see how many stores might have closed. But while this was being made, this project, it was in 25 states, all the way out to Arizona and up through, north into like Indiana and Ohio, places like that, and up through Pennsylvania at that time. Maybe one store or two stores in Western Maryland. And one of the interesting decisions I had to make was, how far am I going to go? And what I chose to do is keep it in the Southeast, because I perceived Waffle House as this Southern institution. And their headquarters is outside of Atlanta. Technically, it is a Southern-based company, but it goes further than that. Yet most people perceive it as a Southern-based thing. And so I wanted to lean into that a little bit. So I decided, I'm going to stop at Louisiana and Arkansas in the West. I'm not going to go into Texas, because Texas is its own beast. There's like 1,000 Waffle Houses in Texas or something like that. Maybe not that many, but a ton of Waffle Houses. Plus, Texas is gigantic. And speaking about landscape and ecology and differences in place, like that's its own separate beast, right? Like Texas, like you go up to the Panhandle, that's a very different place than Galveston, Texas. It's very different from El Paso. It's very different from Austin, yet it's the same state. So I felt like that was a whole gigantic barrel of worms that I would love to jump into, but this was not the forum for jumping into that and talking about the nuance of the state of Texas. So I kept Texas out. So it went west to Louisiana and Arkansas, and as far north as Kentucky, Tennessee, and as far east as Virginia. I went up to Virginia. So 11 states total.
I love the intentionality in each of your works, and it's so apparent here as well. You also, you mentioned how, a normal person or a traditional researcher might decide to just make a map of where there are Waffle Houses next to Dollar Generals and things like that, but you took this artistic approach. And I feel like still at the end of the day, though, you are like an artistic researcher. And makes me curious about, with the Tennessee Waters, the project, the Dangerous Waters project, you were going to a state-run institution, right? So it was public, you had some sort of ownership over it. That's not the case for Waffle House, right? And you're going inside of the place and you're taking photos. Like, what was that maneuvering like by comparison?
Yeah, that's right. And so, interestingly enough, that's another reason why I chose Waffle House. Like I chose Waffle House because I wanted that metaphor for the working class. And I felt Waffle House, amongst any fast food chain that was readily available where I was going, was the one that truly just had the perception of working class amongst our society, for good or worse, right? Like that's just the way I was approaching it. And so I wanted that metaphor. And then also in my experience, you can really do whatever the hell you want in a Waffle House. And most people, so long as you are being respectful and not breaking any laws, that's part of its charm, right? We could go there in college if we were inebriated, or we could go there in college at 4 a.m. You could sit in the same booth and study for like an entire day if you wanted to, so long as you were being nice and it wasn't like jam-packed and they needed you to get up at that table. So this idea, like, you could wear whatever you want in a Waffle House so long as you're wearing something. In your pajamas, and like it was interesting to be in a space as an adult and think, oh, no one's really going to hassle me if I'm making photographs in a Waffle House, because they just don't care so long as I'm following the rules. So that's another reason I chose Waffle House. And then the third reason I chose Waffle House is they're all the same. There's some variability in the architecture here and there, but for the most part, it is a rectangle with two sides of that rectangle, floor to ceiling, plate glass windows. So I had the vantage point I needed to photograph through. Everything looked the same, so I knew all the photographs would have that same framework, and it created a very conceptual frame for me to have repetition in this project, right? If I'm going to present 42 images in a book, all 42 of those images are going to be the same, because I want you to see what I'm seeing through the windows. And so I'm taking that choice away from you and showcasing that. And so that idea of repetition in this project became very important. And so I knew when I wanted to do this project, I needed to also have my own set of rules. And so I would go into a restaurant, I would sit down where there was space available, and I would usually order coffee. I would always order something so that I was there for, a 10, 15-minute period of time to have a Waffle House experience. And then I would only photograph from where I was sitting, looking out the windows. And, I would turn around, look around. Oh, maybe that's interesting. I'll turn around this way. But I never went into the space, sized it up, and said, "Ooh, let me go to that booth." Rarely would I ever even have the opportunity to do that, because most of the time these restaurants were full, and I would have to choose whatever space was available to me to sit in. And so I replicated that every time. And there was always the same, so that I wanted it to be consistent across the entire spectrum of the project.
So you did produce a book from the Vistas, and did you do the writing for this one as well?
So I did part of the writing. So there's an essay that I wrote, and there's also a foreword by a writer, a New Orleans-based writer, Maurice Carlos Ruffin. And then sort of, it's not really an introduction, but more of a very in-depth afterword or epilogue discussion about this project by a writer from North Carolina named Laura Bullard, which is beautiful. It's a beautiful essay. And what's great about this project is I told these two writers, I want you to write about your experience. Sure, you can mention my work. It's going to be in this book and talk about my images, but I don't want you to hold back. Like, what is your relationship to a Waffle House? Or what is your relationship to the imagery and content that I'm trying to discuss, right? The imagery and content of maybe being in a Waffle House in times when you are down on your luck or severely working class. And so both of them had a very different take on that, and they're beautiful pieces of writing that complement the imagery really well. And then the main essay of the book is the one that I wrote that talks about, Waffle House is a communal space. Waffle House is a metaphorical space for the working class, and a metaphorical space for people to dream big and to, have to approach life with so many obstacles. We all have obstacles in life, but most of us in this country are really hardworking and trying very hard to overcome those obstacles and doing what is necessary to overcome those obstacles, even if it means having 3 jobs. And that's not ideal, right? And of course, this was written and done before the pandemic. So a lot of the discussion and a lot of the narratives that I started to really try to document and talk about have just been exacerbated by the pandemic and just like blown wide open. And our approach collectively to those issues has been really intriguing, because not all of us are responding the same way, but I think all of us are now seeing some of these as being very serious problems. And so that has me in this space now, 3 years later, reflecting differently on this project.
It will be very cool post-pandemic, during pandemic versus pre-pandemic to see. I mean, we think so much about our essential workers and how they're not just the people who are degreed to, save lives in a medical sense, but the people who are putting food on the table, and how restaurants like Waffle House are riding the wave of just different employment trends that we're currently facing. I asked about who wrote the book though, because I'm curious, like, I know you're going in, you're sitting where it's available, you're taking your photos for like 15 minutes, but is there any other like maybe rhythms of your practice? Like, are you listening to the sounds of the plates clanging or like the conversations happening around you? Like, are there other influences going on while you're there? Are you taking notes?
Yes, I am.
Right later.
Yeah, I take notes. I'm always very aware of when I'm making photographs. And in many ways, I would sit in this restaurant for 20, 25 minutes before I picked up the camera to make the image. And I would just stare at the same stuff I'm about to photograph and think about it, right? What do I want this image to say? And always listening, talking to people in the restaurant, hearing their conversations, all of that is happening. And I tend to be the kind of photographer that'll be in a space for quite a while and be very thoughtful about what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing, and then make imagery very fast. Like, think about it, process it over a period of time, and then say, all right, this is what I want to do, and then go. And I'll just make imagery. And then inevitably I'll think of something at the end and say, oh, let me try that too. And then usually the stuff at the end is the better stuff. But I think I need all that time to process my intention within a space so that I can make the right imagery.
Yeah, I think there's some like reverence for it too, and just acknowledging this is a place where people are living and working. And I think it's really cool that you are taking the time while you're there to just, get in the posture of taking this photo and having that moment.
Yes, I think that's really important. And I mean, even in the dangerous waters work, no matter what I do, there is reverence for my subject matter. Um, or else I wouldn't be photographing it. I
Yeah.
think like, so this idea of the vernacular, this idea of like, you know what, I'm photographing locations and I am photographing societies that people live in. Like, this is their identity. This is where they live. This is maybe not by choice, but this is where they operate. Um, and so the level of respect for that and the level of wanting to make sure that I represent it properly, the responsibility of that is very important to me. I never ever want to be in a space where I am exploiting somebody else's narrative for my artistic gain. And I rarely, even when I am being biased. And so Waffle House Vistas is a project where I am making sure I'm telling you what I want you to talk about. Whereas Dangerous Waters, I said, I'm going to have multiple points of view. No, Waffle House Vistas is my point of view. Like, you're going to look at these gas stations, you're going to look at these strip malls, you're going to look at these parking lots, and think about the people who live here, because I have lived in places like that, right? And I know them very well. And so that intentionality, I think, is very important. And it's interesting when you call them reverent, because I think that's actually correct. I do have a serious love for this type of space, this type of architecture. And it's not true love, right? I'm not a big fan of strip malls. I'm not a big fan, certainly not a big fan of payday loan lenders and things like that. But I'm a fan of what it represents, right? Like, here is this location, here is this economic building that is doing something in this neighborhood, good or bad. It was built with intention, and it says something about the people living here, or more importantly, it says something about the people that chose to make the investment to build this building in this neighborhood.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult conversation. And so we went to the beach. My family went to the beach this summer, before Delta really kind of took over. And I realized that I love seedy beach towns, right? Like, I really dig it, right? Like, there's something about like the people that mix into these spaces. And I would much rather do that than go to a resort town. That's sort of cleaned up and homogenized to be a brochure. I like being in a place that's not a brochure. But that doesn't mean I don't like also going to the brochure and then taking photographs of that and being like, oh man, look how clean this place is. Let's photograph the underbelly of this place. But this idea that I am representing where people live, and I'm representing real people with real ambitions and real struggles and real lives, and that can never be taken for granted.
Yes. In social work, we talk a lot about, the micro, the meso, and the macro. Like the micro being like the individuals, the meso being like the community, and the macro is like the policy level. And I think when you look at the macro of your work, like you look at the 40 something photos together, it's probably going to speak to, bigger cultural themes about our country, themes about corporations. But then you can look at the individual photo and it can speak to those patterns of everyday life. And you've mentioned in some of your other reflections in your work that it's investigating how land use and social history influence that cultural geography. And I wonder if you had any other sort of like asides or anecdotes of like specific moments in any of these Waffle Houses and how the culture of the place was happening within and through.
Yeah. And what's interesting is people always want that. They're like, oh man, tell me about the line cook that was working that day. Like, they're fascinated by the people who work there or the people who eat there. That doesn't fascinate me because I eat there. Like, I'm one of those people that you seem to be fascinated with. But what was the most telling, and something I did not anticipate, and I should have, but I didn't, is that each one of these Waffle Houses, when you enter into that space, even if there's only 2 people in there, it is hyper local. So you have these cookie cutter shoebox restaurants all scattered throughout the land. The food's exactly the same no matter where you go. The only thing that changes about it is maybe it's bad. Like maybe you just had a bad cook that day, or bad eggs were made or something. But if not, it's going to be the same. The prices are the same. Everything about it is the same, except the local culture that exists within. And that fascinated me, because I would enter into a restaurant, and if there were regulars there, whoever was working there probably lived somewhat nearby. No one's necessarily going to commute a long distance to work at this Waffle House, because they probably could have worked at a Waffle House closer to their house. So everybody is sort of the place. And unless I'm in a restaurant that's on an interstate where everybody is passing through, the people eating there are of that space. Like my hometown has 4 Waffle Houses in it. And I think if you talk to anybody in that town, they know the one that they go to. And they have a very real reason. We go to that Waffle House. So being in these spaces, I would get to experience very hyper local culture of the cities and towns that I was visiting in a condensed way. And I was invited into those spaces. And that was also fascinating, is like, if I'm going into a Waffle House, no, I'm going into this Waffle House in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And so I was at the mercy of the people that run that store and that exist and are eating within that store. And they're inviting me in. I'm not from Orangeburg. They could tell I wasn't from Orangeburg, but I came into their Waffle House and I was welcomed. That is a fascinating thing. I don't think that's replicated in a Hardee's or in a Taco Bell. The only thing I can think of where that is replicated is a Dunkin' Donuts in New England, right? Like places that are regional, that is a space that people congregate in, do business in, see each other in, and that is safe and common for all. And that's not to say Waffle House is always safe, but you want it to be safe, right? You want to go into a restaurant, you want to have a safe experience, and you want to be in a space that is not going to judge you, that'll let you do what you want to do in that space, be who you are in that space. And that's how I felt going into all of these stores. As people allowed me in, they let me be who I was. I would talk to them, I'd ask questions, we would have really long conversations. Sometimes I'd be in a store for 2 hours, sometimes talking to people. But it was always okay. I was who I was, I respected who they were. And when I left, they wished me well on the rest of my travels. And that is, I've never had that experience at McDonald's. And I wasn't seeking that experience, but it just happened in these places. That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it is super fascinating. I certainly know my Waffle House. We definitely have more than one in my town, too. But as a person who's consumed Waffle House on the go too, I can attest to that. Being welcomed in and having that like local experience. I think it's really valuable and really cool how your work enables more people to have a glimpse of what that local experience could be in many different locales, and then to abstract to what it means about our country and how it's structured and this vernacular architecture and all the good stuff. So we started with your background, and you had started in painting. You also dabble in printmaking work. Is that all happening too? I know we focused this conversation on
Yeah.
photography, but I'm interested in how all of those things kind of add value to your artistic, continued motivation and interest.
Yeah. Yeah. It does still happen. It doesn't happen as often. And I think that's because I have a lot of ideas in the photographic realm. So I have a number of projects that I'm working on right now, that are photo projects. And so if I have a certain amount of artistic time available to me each week, I'm usually putting that energy toward the stuff that I know I need to get done, or I know is in a forward trajectory. The printmaking and the painting at this stage is a little bit more experimental. It's been a long time since I did it very seriously. And so I'm not sure how I want to use those media and what I want to say in that media again, which is fun to be in that sort of fertile space of unknowing. But there's a lot of play involved with that. Trying to find exactly what I want to say using those processes is very important to me, as well as finishing the projects that I want to make and the things I want to talk about, particularly in the photographic realm.
I can't wait to see all the things you continue to talk about in the photographic realm. I think your work is very powerful, and it speaks for itself in so many levels of why it matters. But I'd love to hear in your words why do you think photography matters and art in general? What keeps inspiring and motivating you to show up and experiment?
That's really interesting because I think photography in particular is at this strange crossroads. It's getting much more at times lyrical and abstract, and there's a lot of really great artists that are pushing the limits of photography in new and intriguing ways. But that doesn't necessarily interest me as somebody who is also a painter. I can create whatever I want in my brain and paint it. And I have friends who are sculptors, and they'd rather like sculpt something and put it in a big space rather than sculpt something and photograph it and then experience the photograph. So, there's different types of artists that are coming to photography from different ways. And, from my standpoint, what photography does that I really like is I am able to not only look at and affirm the world we live in, but also then use the power of the lens, the power of the camera to give it respect and freeze it and say, let's bring it back. I don't do a lot of heavy editing. I don't do any of that stuff where I like take the sky out and put a new sky in. You tend to see what I saw. And I do my best to make the best photograph I can at the point of origin and not do a whole lot of editing and post. And so this idea of affirmation of place, affirmation of landscape, affirmation of the people of that place, but doing so from the landscape side. I don't necessarily make a lot of portraits of the people of these places because the story is not actually about them, right? The story is not about, Nancy, who works at a Waffle House, or George, whose dad worked for TVA, or whose great grandfather had land that's now at the bottom of a lake. The story is much bigger than them, right? They are pieces in that story. And the story, like you said, is the macro. And photography allows me to stitch together images of an intimate nature to then talk about the macro in ways that apply to all of us and to invite people into those conversations.
Yes, it makes me think back to your project that was hyper local, as you described it, in your community. And I feel like, photography is a really cool way to keep a digital archive or a visual record of what a place looked like. I think that as we evolve, we forget maybe how different we are than where we started. And so to have that point of reflection, even if for the most part, most of the time, people outside the locale don't pay attention to it, it's going to be a very useful data point, I think, when we're 30 years out and we've done, like, it looks nothing like it did at that point in time. So I think it's a cool way to capture history too. And I'm thankful that you're doing that work. I'd like to also ask, what's your advice to people who are trying to pursue maybe social justice through visual language? Maybe they're trying to be do some sort of social commentary in their creativity, or they just want to draw attention to something that they feel like we're not looking at and need to pay more attention to.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And, I teach university here and there as well. And I get this question a lot from students who want to take a more activist role. And, I would always say, and I always sort of tell them, you need to make work about something you're passionate about, right? So if you're passionate about something that you want to draw attention to or have a more activist role with, especially if you're trying to be commentary on something, injustice, anything like that, you need to make good images. You need to make good work. I feel like we're inundated with information, no matter what it is, not just images. People say, oh, we're inundated with, no, we're inundated with everything. Our ability to hold a thought and remember in our society, especially where we are in the pandemic, is like a day. We will forget astronomical, earth-shattering things that happen to our society within a week because we're just flooded with more stuff, especially when the whole world is sort of in a crisis mode. And so I think you need to be in a place making this art that your brain has slowed down. Doesn't mean the art needs to slow down, but you need to really think about it. Like if you're at a protest or if you're witnessing injustice, you're trying to make art about injustice. You need to do it in a thoughtful way. because that's how it's going to break through. The power of a single image will break through, but there's really good photojournalists that's what they do. Like they get to that spot, they make that singular image that then affects us deeply. But that's not necessarily how somebody who's not a photojournalist can raise attention on an issue. So I think thinking about the causes you care about in thoughtful ways is really important, and making work about it that lets people in to that conversation so that you can change hearts and minds, I think is actually more effective than hammering your thought process over the head of somebody else, because that can actually be off-putting at times. And so if you want people to reach an emotional place or a moral place in the argument you're trying to make, bring them into that, be persuasive and win that argument. I think that is harder to do. It's much easier to make imagery that is super biased, that is just like, this is how the world is, it's messed up and we need to change it. But it might not be the most effective way to change.
Right.
And so it's difficult, and that can be hard for artists that want change now. To really truly, I think about some of the most powerful artists that draw attention to work and draw attention to narratives and injustice. And it is, the work they create is very well thought out, very sensitive, sometimes loud, but a lot of times very quiet. And it draws you in, and it keeps you in front of that photograph or in front of that sculpture for a long period of time. It makes you feel things. That's how you do it.
Yes, there's certainly enough hammering on the head on the world of Facebook. I feel like, you get into these different combative discussions in
Who wants
social.
it?
It's so much. In social work, we talk about, really walking alongside people, meeting them where they're at. And I think it's so important and valid that like real change will not happen for an individual unless they want it to happen for them and unless they make the decision themselves. So a photo can lead someone to start thinking about decisions they might want to make, but the hammering approach doesn't generally work for a sustained amount of time, probably. It also made me think of, you mentioned, the importance of like having a slower approach, like taking a chance to let the situation sink in, reflect on how you're going to photograph it, things like that. And I was listening to a sermon recently, and the woman was talking about how like you need to be still in a moment. And that doesn't mean like slouching over, like falling asleep, but like being still and standing and like taking something in actually takes a lot of energy and consciousness to keep your body present. Like if you've spent a lot of time walking that day, it's actually rather uncomfortable to just keep standing upright. But really, the act of being still is an act and is powerful and takes energy and can achieve a lot if we lean into the discomfort of stopping moving, which is
and
not.
listening.
And listen.
Right? Listen to people, listen to the world around you. And I think too, I tell students make, they're so passionate. They come like, I want to talk about this. And they don't realize that it's a nuanced conversation. Like to them, it's hyper real. They're like, this is a universal truth to me, and I need to talk about it. And I'm like, but it's not a universal truth to other people. And so people need to understand, and you need to understand as the artist, as the storyteller, as the representative of other voices, that it's actually a conversation that has context and nuance. And you have to get people from other places in life into that nuance to understand how you feel, so that then maybe they can come to that universal truth that you have already accepted. And that's hard, right? But that's the kind of work I like to do is, let's talk about these things and let's have a rich conversation about them. And none of us are actually going to be right in this regard. But we should be able to understand how multiple people are trying to feel and are being represented.
What a world it would be if we all did that with mastery. It's
Right.
the world I want to live in and fight for and keep trying for. So I feel very encouraged to move in that direction with you and your students and all the people doing the work. Finally, I want to ask you, it's a two-part thing. What do you want people to leave knowing about you and your work? And what are you really looking forward to right now?
Well, I think what people can take away is that I look at the world we live in, the true world we live in, and not try to glamorize it, but try to stop, take stock of it, recognize it, and then study it. And also, I think people tend to also think of me as somebody that can look at imagery or look at topics that multiple people pass over and find intriguing ways to talk about them, right? Waffle House is photographed by millions of people. How do I stop and make it fresh and compelling to talk about? Same with the Tennessee Valley Authority. And that's something I like, that challenge. So if you follow me on Instagram, there's a lot of images of gas stations and strip malls and things that are very repetitive that we look at a lot. And it's usually me making the same photograph over and over, trying to figure out how can I make this interesting and fresh and talk about what I really want to say with very common imagery. And so I think a lot of people, if they're going to take anything away from me, it's like, that's the challenge I set for myself. And I look at the world we truly live in, not the world we wish we lived in, I think, in many ways.
That's awesome.
And what am I excited about? Artistically speaking, I have a number of projects that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about, and trying to do them in a way, do them right in many ways. I think Waffle House Vistas showed me a way to make art and to make a project that I want to try to replicate with it, going into it with intention, doing all of that guesswork before I get started, so that when I put my feet on the ground, I'm going. So I have a variety of projects, still working with this idea of tourism and, beach towns and beach resorts, and working on some imagery about like Walt Disney World and how that is a space that all of us can relate to in some capacity. And again, what is that theme with Micah? Let me take something that everybody has photographed a million times and make it new and fresh and compelling. And what can I talk about cultural geography in a space like that? Actually, quite a lot. But how do I do it? That's the challenge of the day.
Oh, I can't.
So that's what excites me.
I can't wait to see it all happen. I'm so appreciative to you, Micah, for sharing your wisdom and your process and taking the time to speak with me on this afternoon. I can't wait to share your story.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you. It's been a real treat. Thank you.